on your radio dial. Your favorite station for music and news. We hope we'll always be the friendly voice of Indiana, WIBC.
When Jeff Smulyan heard this classic radio jingle, he was just a young boy pedaling his bike around his North Side Indianapolis neighborhood, never dreaming he'd one day own the legendary WIBC radio and then go on to become a trailblazer in the media industry, a U.S. ambassador, and owner of a Major League Baseball team. Entrepreneurship is in Jeff Smulyan's blood. Get to know this Indiana media pioneer and community leader on this episode of the Business and Beyond podcast. Hello and welcome to the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. I'm Gary Dick. Well, Jeff Smulyan's Hoosier roots run deep. He grew up in a family of entrepreneurs. His business mind passed down from his grandparents and parents. Jeff knew it in high school, knew he wanted to get into radio. He started small in the 1970s, launching radio station WNTS, which featured none other than David Letterman in the midday time slot. After that, he founded Emmis Communications, which fostered new, historic, and everlasting genres in the world of radio. Jeff Smulyan established the first all-sports radio station in the country. It's a pioneer in hip-hop radio, and eventually Emmis grew into the largest privately owned radio broadcasting company in America. That's not the entire story, and for more, I'm pleased to be joined by one of Indianapolis's most successful media pioneers and a friend, Emmis Communications CEO Jeff Smulyan. Jeff, welcome.
Gary, thanks. Fun to do this.
Yeah. Well, how you doing? I know you're right now. We're doing this virtually in the age of the pandemic. How are you? You're in your office in downtown Indianapolis. How have you been faring through the pandemic?
Pretty well. We like everybody else haven't traveled. Don't go to a lot of meetings. Spend my life on Zoom. But it's pretty good. I've now had both of my vaccinations, so I'm excited about that. My wife and I have decided that we can venture back into restaurants maybe soon. So, listen, everybody's healthy. We're fortunate. I got no complaints.
Yeah, that's good. What's your gut feeling now? I mean, I think there seems to be a sense that maybe things are beginning to get back to normal. Do you sense that 2021, maybe a little bit later in the year, we'll be back in a much better place?
I think so. I think you'll see the vaccinations ramp up to around 3 million a day. And I think that by the end of May, most Americans will have had vaccinations. And then I think it'll just take a while for confidence to come back. And then we're pretty optimistic about the year from a business standpoint and just from a quality of life standpoint.
Jeff, the arrival of spring in Indianapolis in March Madness, that always brings some optimism. And this year, the entirety of March Madness is going to be here, and much of it in Indianapolis, some in West Lafayette and in Bloomington. Is there any doubt in your mind? I mean, this is unique, never been done before, the entire tournament in one location. Is there any doubt in your mind that Indy is going to hit it out of the park?
No, none whatsoever. We were really born to do things like this. And the organization here, the level of volunteers, the level of leadership from the sports corp, and everybody, I could not be prouder. Our Super Bowl experience still is considered the most professionally done of all of them. We're just really good at it because we got great people who really work hard.
Jeff, you're obviously passionate about your company and your industry, but also about Indianapolis. And as you were talking, I was thinking back, can't remember what year it was, but I believe you gave a speech, a pitch, if you will, when Indianapolis was bidding on one of its Final Fours. And I had more people come to me or mention that to me, your talk and how passionate you were about the city and the role that sports has played in Indianapolis and why that's important. Talk a little bit about that and your thoughts.
I gave a speech in Seattle many years ago and talked about the fact that sports can really be the great unifier. It's the one thing that can bring people together, white and black, young and old, rich and poor. People rally around sports, and I think you've seen it really be the cornerstone of how Indianapolis has really reinvented itself. And I know all the arguments, pluses and minuses about why do we spend money on an arena when we've got so many other issues? But it really has revitalized certainly the downtown and the community. And, you listen, when the Colts won the Super Bowl or when the Pacers were in the NBA finals, it just unifies the community and brings people together. And if there's ever a time when people need to come together, it's now.
Yeah. You grew up on the north side of Indianapolis, a native of the city, suburban Jewish family living in a predominantly non-Jewish neighborhood, how you describe it. You love sports, riding your bike through the neighborhood. It was a different time. Do you think that kind of thing is gone now? It doesn't seem like you see kids riding their bikes through the neighborhood anymore, playing baseball outside. Are those times gone forever?
Well, I think that they are gone. Society's become more complex. We laugh that as long as we were home by 6 o'clock for dinner, we could have been riding our bike to Botswana, and our parents would have known. Or we were always playing ball somewhere in the neighborhood. It is a different time. It's a more complicated time, no question.
You went to North Central High School, and you say you may have been one of the few people who knew exactly what you wanted to do while you were in high school. Talk about that, because I think it came from a love of listening to Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle and those types of things on the radio.
Yeah, there's no question. I always loved radio. It was a time when transistors came about and radio was reinvented. And I've talked to so many friends in the industry who, listened to ball games late at night or listened to Top 40 when they were supposedly studying. And it just became such a central part of our lives. Something else that's sort of gone. Every kid, when I was a kid, every kid listened to Joe Light at WIFE. Somebody said the ratings of that radio station were like 75% of all radio
Wow.
listening to one show. Those days are long gone. You don't see 5% of the Americans watching the same TV program now. So it was a different era, but it was, between that and listening to ball games, I just fell in love with the radio business.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that. Was it kind of a love affair? I mean, really a passion that you had.
Yeah, and when I went away to school at USC, which I loved, and USC has been an integral part of my life for all these years. I've been on the board of trustees for over 20 years now, and it's one of my great passions. And I was going to get a master's degree. I hate to say this. I was going to go to Stanford to get a master's in telecom, and somebody said, study law. And I have to laugh, Gary. In those days, nobody said, go get an MBA.
Right.
It's amazing. Yeah. Today, 100 people out of 100 would say, well, you want to be in management, get an MBA. But then it was like, go to law school. I studied broadcast law, wrote my law review article on the FCC. And somebody said, if you want to be an entrepreneur, get a law degree. It's amazing how much the world's changed.
Yeah. What attracted you to USC?
I had a cousin who went there, and it was, the 60s, and it was like California. And there just seemed to be a magic to, being in Southern California that I just always thought would be great. I actually thought I'd go there for a couple of years and I'd come back. I never dreamed that I would spend 7 years there. People say you spent 7 years there, and I always laugh and say, yeah, but I was almost a second semester sophomore. But in reality, I really got a law degree too.
That's outstanding. As you think back on that, was there a favorite memory or something that happened to you at USC that you really will always remember?
Oh, there were so many friends. I mean, there were so many crazy times. I loved it. Somebody asked me years later, what would you like to do in life? And I said, I'd like to be a senior in college one more time. That would be my fondest wish. I loved it. Just made a lot of lifelong friends. Developed a great affection for the university. Yeah.
Yeah. You thought about maybe staying out there though, right?
I did. I was going to. My dad talked me into coming back. It was really, he said, look, come back. Your mom and I want you back here. And he first talked me into it, he was kind of unrelenting. And when I first came back, I said, oh my God, what have I done? I'm back here. But it took me about 6 months, Gary. And then I just fell in love with this place. And now, over the years, our biggest businesses have been in New York and Washington and LA and Chicago and San Francisco. And people always go, what do you live there for? And I go, this is home, and I love it. And I love being a part of a place that's really, really done some fun, exciting things.
Well, you returned in 1973 to Indy. Your dad, I think, had purchased WNTS radio station for about $400,000, right? And you were the VP and GM of the station. And one of your employees back then was a guy by the name of David Letterman, right?
Yes, he was. Yeah.
What was it like? What was he like?
Dave was great. Dave was the weekend weatherman at Channel 13, and my brother said you got to hire Letterman. And we knew each other peripherally. He had gone to Broad Ripple. David's 5 days younger than me, and we hired him, and when he took the job, he said, "Look, I'm going to do this for a year. I'm going to take a chance to go to California and see if I could be a writer and a comedian." He was brilliant. The problem was he was doing talk, and talk radio has always been the province of 65 and 70-year-olds. And here you got a 25-year-old guy who's basically, talking about my favorite memory was coming back from lunch one day, and I got a call from an irate listener, and he said, Letterman, he's a communist. And I said, well, why is he a communist? Well, he said, I called him and said, the communists are taking over Carmel. And he said, you got to let them have Carmel. He said, the schools are overcrowded and the roads are always a mess and traffic's awful. You got to give them Carmel. Let's hold the line at Nora. And I mean, that was Dave. And I'll never forget. One day he said, look, I've got big news. The city of Indianapolis has sold Monument Circle to Guam. And we're going to replace it with 150-foot asparagus. And I mean, we had people call and say, you can't do that. How can you get rid of it? But I mean, it was just, one day he said the 500-mile race, people are complaining about sitting in the turn, so they're going to make it all straight away and the race will be from here to Kansas City. And we had people calling saying, hey, I'd like, can I get tickets in like Effingham? I mean, it was absolutely brilliant. My friend David Clapper, who's one of the founders of the Finish Line, was working at his dad's liquor store. And he used to listen all day. And he said, there's about 50 guys in town who do nothing but listen to Letterman all day when they're working.
Wow.
And the problem was all the 25-year-olds absolutely loved him. And the 65-year-olds thought the guy's a Bolshevik, so it taught me a lot about the available audience.
That is outstanding. What, any other lessons learned with that first, managing that first station?
Yeah, I learned to get over my fear of failure. It was an impossible task, and I think I realized that. I joked we were going up against WIBC. We had a daytime station on the wrong end of the dial, 1590. We had to sign off in the winter at 5:30 at night. WIB. I used to joke we were doing news in the morning, and I said, we could hire Walter Cronkite as our morning newsman. And 90% of Indianapolis would say, forget Cronkite. Fred Heckman's the only guy with any credibility. And it was a challenge. I got over it. The other long-lasting experience was Rick Cummings, who you know well.
Yep.
Rick had just graduated Butler, and Rick actually came in to do production. And then when Dave went to California, Rick became our midday guy, and we developed a lifelong friendship. And I said, Rick, when I start my company, I want you to be my programming guy. And sure enough, a few years later, when we started Emmis, he came and became our first program director. And as of at least 20 minutes ago, he's still here 40 years later. So,
wow.
Yeah. So that was one of the great things that I learned.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned launching and starting Emmis. By the way, what does Emmis? What does that word mean?
Emmis is the Hebrew word for truth. It was also the title of a book I was writing about sports and espionage and politics called The Emmis Region. And I thought it'd be cool to name the company, Emmis.
So you love books. You've always been a voracious reader.
I'm a fanatical reader. I spend too much time reading emails and memos, but I read 4 newspapers a day. Don't read as many books as I'd like, but do read, a number of books a year. But there was a favorite line in a movie called 3 Days of the Condor. I don't know if you remember. It was a Robert Redford movie, and he's a basically an analyst for the CIA. And he goes to lunch one day, and everybody is murdered. And he finds out that they were targeting him. And one of my favorite lines, he said, "Why do they want me? I'm just a reader." And I've always thought about that.
Any special genre of books you like?
Yeah, I love politics, nonfiction. I'm not a great fiction reader. It's just mostly nonfiction,
Yeah.
current events, history.
You launched Emmis in 1980. Talk about that, starting the company in the 80s. Wow, what a decade, and the acquisitions you made throughout the country and radio, and you ultimately expanded into television and publishing, and really created quite an empire.
Yeah, and I always say life's a roller coaster. We were fortunate. We put WNS on the air in 1981, July 4th, and it skyrocketed. And then we bought WLOL in Minneapolis, and then we bought KC in St. Louis, and what became Power 106. We had done very well with KC and LOL and ENS. We didn't get Power right in the first year, and then we switched it to hip hop, where it then became one of the probably 5 most dominant stations in America. And then we went and bought Doubleday. We bought out our original investors, Mickey Maurer and Bob Schloss. And then we bought the Doubleday stations. And the whole company was premised on the fidelity of FM, Gary. We said, look, AM, in those days, everybody said, AM is still going to be dominant. We said, no, we think FM is going to be key. And we sort of proved that by creating FM music stations that did very well. But the Doubleday stations came with an AM. And Steve Crane, who was a lifelong friend, and Steve started with me. When I started Emmis, he was practicing law and said, I'm bored. And he came in. We've been friends since 3rd grade. And we were sitting in a coffee shop in New York one night, and he said, what are we going to do with the AM? And I said, well, I've kind of always wanted to do all sports. I thought about this idea since when I was like a junior in college, not paying attention in a telecom class. And when I broached the idea to Rick Cummings and Doyle Rose, who were our 2 senior guys, they both laughed and said, that's the stupidest idea we've ever had, or you've ever had. And we had a managers meeting, and it got voted down. And Steve turned to me and said, what do you want to do? I said, you can't lead where others won't follow. So we're not going to do it. And the next day, Rick and Doyle walked into my office and said, look, we still think it's a really stupid idea, but, we owe you one, and we're doing great everywhere else. So we launched it. And Jim Lampley used to call it the Vietnam War of Emmis for the first couple of years. And then it was known as Smulyan's Folly. But then we bought the NBC stations in 1988, and we moved it to 660 on the dial, which is a better signal. And we got Don Imus. And when we got Don Imus, the whole thing just came together. And then it became, not Smulyan's Folly, but this brilliant idea that was taking over American radios. I always say, Gary, the line between being a genius and an idiot is very fine. And I've been on both sides many times. And with the Fan Project, I went from idiot to genius. And with the Mariner Project, I went from genius to idiot. So I've seen all sides of it.
Back and forth. So you really are, the father of sports talk radio.
Yeah. That'll probably be my
now.
Unless I blow up a train station, it'd probably be in my tombstone. Either that or the father of hip hop radio. I don't know which.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you next, because you are an innovator not only in sports radio, but in hip hop. What was it? Was it a station in LA? Was really the first hip hop station? Talk about that and how that progressed. And now it's huge.
Yeah, it was the first rhythmic top 40 station. It really wasn't hip hop in the beginning. And really all the credit for hip hop is from Rick Cummings. We launched it in 1986. It was gigantic. It became one of the most dominant stations in America. And then 5 or 6 years later, it started getting long in the tooth and the ratings declined. And we said, Rick, figure it out. What do you do? And Rick, talked to people. And I'll never forget, we had a consultant who helped us. And he said, look, I think this hip hop thing is big. And the consultant said, I don't know what it is. So Rick said, well, we probably don't need the consultant anymore. But we did hip hop in LA, and it rejuvenated the station. Then we did it in New York at Hot 97, and they then became really and still are today, the 2 largest hip hop stations in the world.
Yeah. Well, the ticking sound we hear now, Jeff, is our 2-minute drill. This is a point in the podcast where we ask you some quick questions, get some quick answers from you on the most pressing issues of the day. So are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready to go.
Okay, favorite movie of all time?
Yeah, probably Animal House or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or maybe even Spartacus. I always loved Spartacus as a kid.
I love it. How about Favorite TV show growing up?
Well, I love Rocky and Bullwinkle. I love the writing in Rocky and Bullwinkle. There were others, but that sort of jumps out at me.
Yeah, favorite music?
Oh, I love rock and roll. I like a lot of, old rock and roll, classic, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones.
Yeah. AM or FM?
Well, we built a company on FM, so I guess I got to say FM. Yeah.
Biggest pet peeve?
Intolerance, I think. I think this thing that scares me as we live in a society, two pet peeves, that and just lack of sort of fact-based reality. Ignoring the facts scares me a lot.
Dream dinner. You've got a table at St. Elmo. Are the three people, living or deceased, who you'd love to have dinner with?
Well, believe it or not, I love my family. But the people I've admired, Irv Katz, who was a mentor to me, started Katz, Epper, and Miller. Jerry Reinsdorf has been a big brother to me for 30 years. I loved Bill Clinton. I thought Bill Clinton was one of the most remarkable human beings that I've ever known. So in spite of his peccadillos, brilliant guy.
Breakfast ball or no mulligans?
Definitely breakfast ball.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. Front and back nine?
Breakfast balls could occur on every hole. So
I like that.
And then they become mulligans.
How do you relax?
I relax. Probably the best stress reliever. I go into the gym every day. I have a gym at home. I live on my elliptical and my Peloton, and I have a weight circuit. I'm a fanatic about that. I can't, if I don't work out every day. And then I love to read, love to play golf on the weekends with friends that play Saturday morning and a lot of Sunday mornings. So that's it. Reading is a big thing, for me.
Yeah. Last one, a sports question. You being a native Hoosier, class basketball or single class?
I like single class. I'm a traditionalist. I miss single class.
I'm with you on that, Jeff. We have lots more to talk about with Jeff Smulyan, including what it was like to buy and own a Major League Baseball team, friendships with Bill Clinton. George W. Bush certainly was a connection as well, consolidating his media empire and a whole lot more. That's when the Business and Beyond podcast, presented by PNC, returns. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. My guest this week is Emmis Communications founder, CEO, Jeff Smulyan. And Jeff, appreciate the conversation. I want to steer toward a love of your sports, and in particular, your ownership of a Major League Baseball team. 1989, was that the year?
Correct.
89, majority investor in a group that purchased the Seattle Mariners. Think back to that whole process, how it started, what you were thinking. Was it exciting, challenging? What kind of the thoughts going through your head as you pursued the Mariners?
Well, we had done Fan, and we had gotten the Doubleday family, which sold us Fan, owned the Mets, so we got to know the Mets people very well. In those days, we couldn't buy any more radio stations in the top markets because you'd only own one FM. So I had a theory about the regionalization of sports and cable TV and broadcasting. And I love Seattle. I had been there as a kid, thought it was the coolest place. And people said, the Mariners are for sale, and you guys, they need marketing, and you guys are marketers. So one thing led to another, and we did it. I would say the first few years were probably the most enjoyable experience of all time, and the last 6 months probably the worst. I always say everybody should be a pariah once in their life, and if you own a baseball team in Seattle, you'll get that experience.
We'll talk about it. I think I remember you sharing that with me at one time in terms of the pariah part and how the fans kind of turned on you. Basically, what was that all about?
Well, we had bought it and said, look, we had a whole plan of making economics work, and we just didn't have the ability. I think, Gary, when we bought it, we said if we could be, we were 14th in the American League when we bought the team, and we said if we can get a cable deal and increase ticket sales and get sponsorships, and we could be 12th in the American League, we'll be fine. And after 3 years, we were further out of 13th place than we were when we started. And we had a $12 million collusion judgment, which nobody expected. One of my favorite stories, you mentioned George Bush. We bought our team after George. And when George bought it, none of the experts thought the collusion would be anything. And he said, when we bought the team, we bought it from Eddie Childs. And he said, Eddie Childs said, I'll pay the first $500,000. You pay everything else. And our lawyer said, that's great. He'll never be more than a couple $100,000. And I said, and our owner, George Ardero, said, well, based on that, you just pick it all up. So everybody said, look, we'll pick up collusion. And when it happened, it was $12 million. And I'll never forget sitting with George. He said, well, Eddie paid $500,000, but because I was so smart, we paid $11.5 million. And I said, well, I was even stupider than you. I paid all $12 million. And the collusion didn't happen when we were in the game. So we sat there and said, well, let's just collude with each other, at least get some benefit for the $24 million we just spent. But I think we knew the history of Seattle baseball was very challenged. And we said, if we can't make it work, we'll put it up for sale. We got a lease. I think the biggest problem was everybody thought that nobody in their right mind would buy the team. So I was going to be the guy who had to move it to Tampa. And I think, Smulyan's going to move the team to Tampa. And that was what really, and the fans were great to me. It was really some of the people in politics and government that I thought were problematic.
And later you thought about buying the Washington Nationals.
Yeah,
right.
We actually had a few other opportunities, the Dodgers, the Nationals. I was probably the biggest mistake I ever made. David Stern was very nice to me. And he was a big fan, and I was a fan of his. And when we got out of baseball, I said, look, I need you to take over the Houston Rockets. So you take it over. We'll find you the money. And I said, David, I got to fix Emmis. I can't do it. And for years, every time I'd see David, he'd say, do you have any idea how much the Houston Rockets are worth today? So, but that's life. You're going to, I have a favorite saying, Gary, if any one of 10 things that happen, my company be 1,000 times bigger. And if any one of 10 other things had happened, I'd be sweeping streets on the monument. So right. I got no complaints.
Yep. What you tell a great story about, and you mentioned Bill Clinton earlier, but a breakfast you had, I think it was while you were the owner of the Mariners in Seattle, this breakfast that you had with him.
Well, yeah, I had a couple friends the one friend who went to school with Bill Clinton, and he said, look, you got to get to know this guy. He's going to run for president. You'll love him. And so he was out there for the National Governors Conference, and we ended up having breakfast. And it's supposed to be, okay, I'll do it. It's Saturday morning at 7:30. And, you think you'll spend 45 minutes. And we spent just 3 hours. And I found him to be probably the most intellectually curious human being I had ever met. And we talked about everything. We talked about sports. We talked about economics. We talked about politics. We talked about international affairs. Just an absolutely engaging, brilliant man.
He actually named you an ambassador, right, to broker a deal between Israel and the PLO. What was that like?
Well, they had asked me if I wanted to do something, and I said, look, I don't want to leave Emmis, but if there's something part-time I can do, I'll do it. And 6 months after he was elected, they said, look, we need a U.S. ambassador to head up the U.S. delegation to the International Telecommunications Union. And every 4 years, the ITU meets. And they basically said, look, all you have to do is you'll have to do 4 or 5 bilateral meetings around the world. And then in advance of the conference, then you go to the conference and it's 6 weeks. It'll be in Kyoto. And I thought, I talked to my kids and they thought it'd be cool. So I did it. And I could, get off the phone. Get out of meetings. And at night, I could call back to the office. And so I was on the phone with the office in Indianapolis every day. So it was great. And I loved it. And it was the time when low Earth orbiting satellites were unveiled. And I loved it. And what happened was, it was right after Oslo. And if you remember Oslo in 94, that was really a breakthrough where you thought you were going to have long-lasting peace between Palestine and Israel. And some of the Arab states came to us and said, look, the Palestinians need telecommunications infrastructure. They've got to build up their telecommunications. And if the United States will do that, the Arab states will recognize Israel. And the Arab states had never recognized Israel in the UN system. So I got thrown into this, and I kind of laughed, and what do I know about diplomacy? But it was wonderful, and I got to really know the Israeli ambassador, the Palestinian ambassador, and the ambassadors from a lot of the other Arab states, and it was wonderful. And we reached an agreement. I was very proud of it. Probably, talk about a fish out of water experience, but it was very, very gratifying.
Wow. I should mention you got to know George W. Bush a little bit because he was an owner with you at the same time he owned the Texas Rangers.
Yeah, and George W. was great. Loved him. We, the young guys, if you remember in those days, we had Gene Autry and Ewan Kaufman and George Steinbrenner. So the young guys would always sit in the back of the room and crack jokes. And George and I were on the ownership committee, and I'll never forget we were walking into a meeting, and there were like two Secret Service agents outside, and I said, what are you guarding outside? The guys in the meeting are the ones who are going to kill him. But he was a great guy, and we've seen each other, and a wonderful person. Really, just a very enjoyable guy.
That's good. Certainly, the media landscape has changed dramatically over the years, continues to evolve. Now, the 90s and beyond brought consolidation and changes at Emmis. Talk about that process, what it was like for you as a business executive, what it was like for you personally as you kind of reimagined and created a new Emmis Communications.
Well, we realized that the world was changing. Probably we didn't realize it soon enough. Probably if we realized it soon enough, we would have probably sold all of our media holdings 15 years ago. But we love the business. When the 08-09 downturn occurred, we were left with about $600 million of debt and leverage ratios, which had gone from like 4 to 13, which, as pretty much makes you insolvent. But we worked through it because we got great people here. We paid off all of our debt. And then right before the pandemic, we sold the controlling interest in two of our stations. So we really ended up, unlike most of our peers, with cash in the bank, and we've transitioned into some new businesses, and it's been gratifying. I love the radio business and the media business as much as anybody, Gary, but it's changed a lot. When you look at the American radio industry today, almost everybody's, either in bankruptcy or technically insolvent. So I feel like we were fortunate to do what we did.
What's next? What's the future in your view? The future of the radio business? Can you look at where's it headed?
I mean, I think there'll always be a demand for it. But when we talk about when I was a kid, every kid listened to radio every day. It was an integral part of their lives. It's not today. They have so many more choices. They have Spotify. They have Pandora, and the streaming services are fascinating. They have a lot of cachet, but they don't make any money. So you have this dilemma where the radio industry has always been profitable, but the profitability has declined, and that makes things tough. I would say it's a business which struggles to match last year's revenues this year, and that's Rick and I always kidded about that's a business where when you're pushing water uphill every day, it gets very, very, very frustrating.
What's next? Final question for you, Jeff, and appreciate you joining me for the conversation this week. But what's next for Jeff Smulyan as you look out the next number of years? What do you want to do? What's kind of on your plate?
Well, I'm one of those people who never retire. I love what I do. I love the people I do it with. So we have one of these special purpose acquisition companies. I kid. There are 350 million Americans and there's 310 million SPACs, but we're on the verge of maybe some deals. I'm on a mission to rebuild Emmis. We bought a sound masking business. We have a dynamic pricing business. We have a branded podcast business. So we're having fun. And I think, not having debt is liberating, and it gives us the chance to sort of look in new areas and hopefully create some value.
Jeff Smulyan, really been a pleasure to sit down and have a conversation on the podcast this week. Appreciate you taking the time. Appreciate all you have done and continue to do for Indianapolis. So thanks for joining us, and best of luck. Hope to see you in person sooner rather than later.
I hope so, Gary. It's always fun talking, but it'd be more fun in person talking.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Jeff Smulyan, the founder, CEO, Emmis Communications. And thank you for joining us on this edition of the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. It is a weekly conversation with leaders in business, politics, academia, sports, and beyond. And for more on the podcast, to subscribe. Also, for Business News 24/7, all you have to do is go to InsideIndianaBusiness.com. I'm Gary Dick. We'll see you next time.